So let's say that as a species, you've decided that sexual reproduction is the way to go. You abandon asexual reproduction and say, we're going to reproduce sexually. Well, that's just the beginning. Now we got to figure out, how do you coordinate everything? You know, when you're fertile, what timing is this going to be? When you reproduce, where? This is nicely illustrated by the spawning of salmon. If they don't make it at the same place at the same time and they're fertile, then reproduction doesn't happen. Look at the flower on the right. That's the focus there, not the bee. The flower has said, I'm going to bloom at this time, and all the other flowers have to bloom with me. And if that weren't enough, we're going to add another layer of complexity in that we need another species to be active and attracted to our pollen, or at least our flowers, to help us reproduce. That does not sound easy, but the payoff must be worth it because lots of species reproduce sexually. Now, you don't have to necessarily have two genders to reproduce sexually. There are plenty of species, snails and worms are a good familiar example, that are hermaphrodites. They have both genders. They still mate and reproduce that way, but they could mate with themselves. Same with flowers. Some of them have sort of genetic roadblocks to reproducing with themselves, but it's at least possible. So there's always that possibility of cheating if you were to have both genders. There are some others that go this parthenogenic route, where all the individuals are females, and some actually even go through the act of mating and then produce young. And so some lizards, not very often, but some reproduce this way. There was even a Komodo dragon that was in captivity for many years and had laid eggs. And then aphids, they actually go through a couple of different ways. They reproduce sexually early in the spring, and then the rest of the time the female just cranks out clones parthenogenically. And so there are ways of reproducing without different genders, but quite a few species do separate genders, sometimes dramatically so. And when the two genders look different, we call this sexual dimorphism. And so you have two different forms of the genders, really seen obviously in many species of birds, but even the crabs with a larger claw, um, gorillas and ungulates, even when we sort of make up species in video games and whatnot, we make them male and female, and there's some obvious traits that go along with this. They have a lot to do with reproduction. Some species even have sequential genders that change during their life. This is mostly fish. They'll start male and usually become female. Being female takes more work, and because of egg laying and care for young, so a lot of times they have to be bigger in this case. How do you determine gender? Well, there's really not one answer. Our familiar example for us is that if you get two X chromosomes, you're female, and an X and a Y, you're male. So, two the same, female, two different sex chromosomes, you're male. But a lot of birds, if not all birds, and a few others, have the opposite situation. If you have two of the same chromosome for the sex chromosome, you end up male. There are some species of reptiles where temperature during this critical period is what determines gender. There are a few where if you get two X chromosomes, you're female, but only one is male. Others, like ants and bees, take this a whole step further, that if you're completely haploid, if you just have one set of all chromosomes, not just the sex chromosome, then you end up male. And females are diploids. Interestingly, when you see honeybees, they're almost all female, despite what the bee movie might tell you. Almost none of that is right. They're almost all female. Males are fairly rare and are completely haploid. And this actually makes all the the workers in the hive more related to the queen than the rest. So a completely different mating system there. All right, so what are our breeding strategies? Let's say we've gone the route of having different genders. What can we do with that? Well, many birds are well known for being monogamous. You have, one partner. Um, Now, usually this is not for life. Sometimes it is, but often it is not. You get serial monogamy, um, which I'd say humans probably very often fall into this category, where you're with one partner for a season, but then after that, you might have a different partner. Uh, in this case, it is interesting uh, that voles taught us some about this. Now, voles can be monogamous or polygamous, polygamous being the other option where you have many partners. We'll come back to that in a moment. It depends a lot on the sex ratio and the environmental conditions. If they're kind of uniform, like everything's spread out, then that tends to favor monogamy. But they also found that in these voles that there's a hormone called oxytocin. Sometimes that's known as the cuddle hormone, that made them monogamous. So this is a hormone released by your pituitary gland in your brain during sexual intercourse and other times that tends to facilitate social bonding. So basically, it makes you attached to your mate. So kind of an interesting one there. Osprey are an interesting bird species, and they definitely take this to quite the extreme. They'll live for 15 to 20 years. They only breed once a year, and they make these huge, huge nests. They can be 6 feet across. They just keep adding to them every year. Um, it takes them 5 months to raise their young. And then, since they hunt in water for fish, they're mainly a fish eating bird. When it freezes over, they can't hunt there. So they go back to South America and then they come north to breed and they come back to the same nest, the pair of them. And this kind of points out why be monogamous. And this usually happens when there's a really high demand on the parents for raising the young. And obviously, that's the case in humans and a lot of birds as well. They got to raise them quickly and they take a lot of energy. Can't leave the nest very easily and just leave them there and defend them for themselves. A lot of times they have to stay warm and they have to be fed quite a bit. Bluebirds, kind of the same sort of thing, not quite as truly monogamous as the osprey. They appear to be monogamous and they raise their young together, but one study showed that in almost half of the cases, not all the young in the nest were by the male that was supposed to be the father. And so there is some shenanigans going on there. So polygamy is really quite common. This comes in two varieties, the most common being polygyny or polygamy, where you have one male, like the elk here, and a harem of females, and he breeds with all of them, and he has to fight for the rights to do that. This is a more common system if having one parent is enough, or if having one male is enough to protect the herd. So often that male is the protector of the herd. We see this with lions as well. And male lions sometimes get a bad rap of just being lazy and the women do all the work. And no doubt about it, they hunt and they raise the young. But if there's a real showdown and some danger, then the male puts his life on the line to protect the herd. And elk do this as well as many other animals in a polygynous system. And let's see, another option, although a bit of a strange one, is polyandry. So I'll just mention it briefly, and that's one female and many males. And so the honeybees, which I already mentioned were a bit unusual, that female will take a nuptial flight. She'll fly out, release pheromones, attracts many males. They all mate with her. Once they do, they actually die. And so she holds the sperm of many males within her and uses it the rest of her life to produce all the offspring. Actually, an unfertilized egg is what makes the males. So that's kind of a strange system there. And so the women get stuck with most of the work with a polygamous system. Bighorn sheep, kind of the same sort of thing. They're competing for rights to mate with the harem, as sometimes they call it. And hopefully you watch the video on the fight that takes place there. Um, One more I mentioned before I leave that is promiscuity, which is common when there's very little care for the young. Increases genetic diversity. Each female breeds with lots of males. Each male breeds with lots of females. You'll see this in rodents, insects, quite a few species where um, you're really just going to leave your young and not take much care of them. Well, if you're going to have genders and you have these sort of organized mating systems, a lot of times the female, especially if she's going to put a lot of work into this, wants to know that she's getting some good genes out of this. Why should I choose you? Why should I feed your babies? And so we have these courtship rituals. And another sort of function of these is just to make sure you have the right species. You go through this programmed ritual that not only are you assessing that you have the right species, but how fit is your mate? Are they going to pass on good genes to the offspring? And so I hope you watched the video on the sage grouse. This a local species has a really elaborate ritual. And a lot of times males, in some of these cases, they'll go hungry and just nearly work themselves to death. That's definitely the case with elk and some other species where they're fighting for the right to mate. A lot of birds have these rituals. Flamingos and albatross are some of the most interesting. They'll mate for life as well, and they have these really interesting courtship rituals that they go through, often each year, just to identify themselves and rebond. They'll click their beaks back and forth and sort of wave their heads back and forth. Even lizards will get into this, and they'll have this dewlap that's showy, and the showier that dewlap, kind of like the showier the feathers, then the more fit he is, and he likes to show that off and do some push-ups and things like that. And we're really not above this. Don't we have a bunch of courtship rituals as well, where we do really pretty silly things? If you think about dating and proms and things like that, where the guy kind of shows his worth. So sage grouse, I've mentioned that one already, where the male competes with lots of other males. So that's a bit unusual. They all just kind of have this sort of battleground where they come together. Red-winged blackbirds, another video I posted there about their singing, and that's a very important part of theirs. Not a lot of violence there, but more kind of a singing show-off. Cooper's hawks are interesting, and a lot of hawks, the female is larger than the male, so he's at a bit of a danger. Quite a few of these hawks, Cooper's hawks especially, eat other birds, and since he's a smaller bird, he's potentially prey. And so males are often very submissive. They'll kind of court the female, often bringing her food. They actually build most of the nest. There's kind of like kestrels as well, and then sort of advertise, hey, I have this great nest, and they'll sing and bring her over and let her check that out. They'll wait for kind of the all clear call by her to be able to come over, and often will feed her as well and the young. So he does a lot of the care. It can't lay the eggs, but he definitely takes a very active role in raising the young. And that's very important for birds because they need to get those young up and flying very quickly. Otherwise, the entire family really is at risk. White-crowned sparrows, one I wanted to point out there is their call, kind of like the red-winged blackbird, is very important for birds, is that call, that really the song. Calls all birds use, but songs are usually the male's domain. Female white-crowned sparrow will do that some, but mostly the male. And he learns it from the other males, not necessarily dad, but he has to learn the right song. Otherwise, he will never get a mate. And So the female does a lot of her own work and takes on a lot of the care for the young and building of the nest, uh, which takes about a week to do. But the male, to sort of get rights and access and prove himself, needs to be able to sing a really good, top notch song. So there's some of the animal mating systems and the complexity in their world. Um, I don't know if any of that helps you navigate the dating world yourself, but uh, there maybe it makes it seem a little bit less intimidating than having to butt horns with somebody else.